Today's lesson is all about rock and all the rock formats that exist. Well, at least the major ones anyway. Let's get to it. Hey Buckaroos, this is the second of where we start dissecting formats. We've done alternative, we've got other ones coming up, but today it's all about rock. And I have somebody who's been doing rock forever, Dave Lange, and he's got a pretty heavy-duty pedigree, long resume, which is great because we're going to grill him. And he's also going to take us through a history of rock from the beginning, so you get a feel for the way it was and how it's morphed into what it is right now, good and bad along the way. Dave Lange, he started programming, oddly enough, like right out of college, out of Michigan State University, which is odd, but then he'll explain why that occurred, because it's right at the beginning of when FM started to matter, because prior to that, the FM frequency, it was dead. Nobody cared. So he was kind of lucky to get a head start on pretty much everybody. So he's been doing it a long time. Along the way, he's programmed some really great radio stations. WSHE, which is, pretty iconic. Another classic rock station in Chicago, WCKG. And also he was the PD of WDVE in Pittsburgh, which I just happened to be riding by, and it was right off the freeway, and I went, hey, look at this. So anyway, threw the phone up, and I guess we're not supposed to do that while you're driving, but I was like filming the building as we were going by, radio guy, typical radio geek. So anyway, that's what that looked like. So, and after that, he went into consulting for Fred Jacobs. Then he went to another great group, which was McVeigh Media, and he was their head of rock for McVeigh Media because they had different formats. There was a country specialist, a rock specialist, which was Dave, and so on and so forth. And then he was senior vice president of programming for Clear Channel. And Clear Channel, if you don't know at the time, was iHeartRadio, which is what it is now, except that then it was well over 1,000 stations. I mean, that's a huge amount of stations to keep track of, and we'll go through that too. We caught up with Dave in Indiana at his hometown, which is also the hometown of Notre Dame. That's pretty cool. Anyway, the video call, it went like this. Hey, buddy, haven't seen you in ages. Thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's these lessons have been very, very interesting to watch, and I think I've learned a few things, even though I've been around a while. I thought maybe there's always something to learn. You'll always be surprised.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to hopefully be learning some stuff from you because you have a huge amount of rock experience, of which I don't have very much. I mean, I managed a rock station, but as far as programming and having to make choices and things like that, like I just as Fred Jacobs used to put it, maybe he still does, I wasn't on that bus. And I think it's a little late to catch the bus at the moment, So, in talking before, we were going to do, you had a sort of a history of rock radio, which I think for somebody who's programming rock, especially someone younger, it's great to know the history of how the format evolved, because it has a lot to do with how you're maybe going to handle things depending on the age of the audience. Like if you're happen to be, in a classic rock situation, you're going to have, 50-year-olds, which would have been at the beginning of the cycles that Dave is going to run through. How many different eras or cycles or whatever?
Well, really, we've got about 3 eras that sort of take us up to where we are today. Okay. Things haven't really changed that much in the last maybe 10 or 20 years, but in the years prior to that, there was quite a growth spurt for the whole format. And we'll kind of go through that because I think it's important to catch those evolutionary points. A lot of those points are still relevant today or still have a big impact on the formats today.
Yeah, 100%. All right. Well, so what's phase one? What was that?
Well, it was really the progressive rock era, we'll call it, from about 1968 to 1978. So let's just step back and take a look at where music was going and where the whole population was going too. Yep. You had the baby boomer audience that was born largely in the 50s. This was the largest generation ever. The peak year for births in the U.S. and Canada was like 57 or 56. So you can see how old these people are. They're all teenagers.
Right.
And, so they're a pretty big, impactful generation. They're starting to have sort of this moment where they're coming of age, and there's a fair amount of protest in the streets and the hippie movement in San Francisco. Music is also changing radically. We went from mono 2-track recording in the 50s to now 4, 8, 16-track recordings. We have multiple studio situations. Look at the evolution of the Beatles. They
Yeah.
went from very simple songs to very complex things by the time we get to the end of this decade
Yeah.
of
Sergeant Pepper and that.
the
Yeah.
60s, et cetera. So a lot of this was changing music, and it was very different than what was on a lot of the top 40 stations at the time. They were
Hmm.
mostly playing records that were 2.5 or 3 minutes long, and they all had kind of a real pop and simple feel to them in a lot of cases. So there was a really quite a few factors going into why this format came to
Yeah.
fruition in this decade. And I think the biggest part of it was that we also had FM stations for the first time.
Right.
While they were
Right.
around in the 50s, not many of them were on the air. So, all of these factors had a real impact.
You love this. We should, gives everybody an idea of what it. So I get the CK, and AM stations are dominant, and this is a big one. So I'm there, but they have an FM station. They have an FM station with the smoking signal. There was virtually nothing on it, and sometimes it would go off the air for days on end, and no one would care. That's how FM sort of didn't count, like in late '60s. Unless you're a beautiful music station, and then all of a sudden with rock, it hit stride big time.
The sort of main elements that you looked at when you were putting together a rock station in this era was that you
Yeah.
wanted to cut down on the hype, the limited playlist, the talking over the music, the super upbeat presentation. There were no jingles, no echo or reverb on the air staff. The imaging was low key. The production and whole presentation was very conversational. It was really designed to respect the music first. And the
Okay.
music came from rock LPs. You played more than one song from each LP in most cases. It was a much larger playlist, virtually unlimited at first.
Wow.
DJs picked their own music, often with a card or library system. There were many different genres of music: blues, jazz, folk, metal, country rock, progressive orchestral rock. Even soul artists were on the air. We played songs in 3 to 5 record sets. They were segued together. Very long songs were welcome. 5 or 6 minutes was pretty much a normal song on the air.
Wow.
Repetition was evil in artist and also songs, even if it was a power rotation, current hot record by the band Led Zeppelin or something. It was more like 2 or 3 times a day a song might get played if it was really important. Really kind of the whole goal in this first era was, if Top 40 did it, you sort of didn't do it. That's kind of the real goal.
So that's phase one. Phase two, what years would they be roughly?
Well, we're going to kind of go in 10-year spans here. This would be the
Okay.
first phase ended by the time we got to 1978. A lot of the progressive rock stations were kind of beginning to fade out a little bit. Things were growing rapidly on the FM band at this point, and we
Yeah.
came up to 1978 to 1988. This whole decade, it really grew a lot. This was sort of the era of Lee Abrams in the Superstars format. He worked with maybe 80 or 90 stations, and most of them were very successful. It really accelerated the growth of the format dramatically.
Yeah, he's one of those very few guys that actually changed radio a lot. There's not very
Yeah.
many of the, it makes a definite turn,
Yeah. There's
given him.
definitely, probably 10 people up there that did it, and he was
Max.
clearly in that class.
Yeah.
We improved the music rotation systems. We had a safe list now. We had index card systems to build a little bit more reliable music rotations. By the end of the decade, everybody was on Selector or Music Master or some sort of system to be centrally programmed. We also introduced comedic and personality-driven morning shows. There was a lot more use of imaging between songs. Segues were a little bit fewer and far between, and we also had stronger brand building from much larger use. Community promotions and events also became extremely important to all of the stations. It was one of the really important parts of the format. You had to reflect the sort of localness that was around you. That was important.
Now there's more than one format, obviously, in rock. There's a bunch of them. When sort of did that kick in?
You get to the 80s and you begin to see certain markets, sporadic stations starting to look at ways to sort themselves out from the pack. You go to a market like Detroit in the early 1980s, you had 4 and even some books with 5 rock stations on FM, all of them with pretty good signals. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, actually, yeah, forgot about that. Yeah, there would have been what Riff, W4 with Stern and Steve
hmm
Dahl, actually almost back to back
right,
before
right,
they moved on. And what was the other one? The ABX, which was pretty free form, or
right.
at least gave
Wheels,
that impression. Yeah, Wheels. Yeah, I forgot
wheels.
about Wheels.
And you also had a couple other from Canada. Really, the big mutations of the format was first classic rock. In that format, you just played 60s, 70s, and some early 80s when we started. As we got towards the end of the decade, it was a few more 80s incorporated into it. But still, to this day, you still don't see much beyond the late 80s on most of these stations. They were targeting 25 to 54 when these stations came on in your marketplace. If you were one of the older AOR stations, the first thing your market manager would say to you would be protect the 25 to 54s. So a lot of stations instantly ramped up their gold quotient, or they just went classic rock and said forget it and quit playing
Yeah,
current. You know,
yeah,
that sort of grew out of that. That became the active rock stations. They focused on harder rock, still playing 40% currents and recurrents. These stations kind of broke away from that pack of stations that were leaning on the older classic rock songs. Then you had another faction called alternative. It really started in the beginning of the decade with the new wave artist, if you will, of that era. It was nearly all currents through most of the 80s because there wasn't much library to play with. As the 90s evolved and grunge came along and pop alternative artists of the late 1990s came along, alternative had a base for its format that it still hangs on to much of it today. We also had an adult alternative format that sort of grew out of this era. Think of KBCO in Boulder, WXRT in Chicago, KFOG in San Francisco. All these stations did pretty well with an adult alternative format that was a little bit deeper. They had some AOR artists in there that were still current driven, but a lot of them are ones that had either a big history or their sound was very compatible with what they were playing with tempo wise the rest of the time. They were more likely to play folk and blues and sort of some alternative artists that had sort of a sophistication to what they were doing. And
yeah.
most of those stations were maybe 25 to 35% current. Those four veins of the format in one way, shape, or form still exist and as really being the only choices you have in rock for the most part.
So that's the past. Where do you think things are going? Trends or anything like that? I mean, does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, classic rock, because it's classic rock and really isn't going to ever play any new records of any note, and it's going to sit with pretty much the same group of artists. This is also the most researched format of the
Hmm.
four, and it doesn't really change that much from
Right.
year to year to year. You've seen some classic rock stations kind of slowly expand their library of titles that they'll play by a given band because pretty soon the audience gets a little bit tired of that. The early days of grunge are now almost 30 years ago. So you have to be careful with this format that while a lot of this is great music and it does tend to get younger audiences to listen to it than you would think, you have to worry a little bit about what's going to happen as, life goes on and this audience fades away. Where do we go after we've got all of the funeral homes on the air?
Yeah.
What's next,
Yeah.
Nothing, I guess.
That's probably where you actually know that, they have certain things in the stock market where when this happens, we're headed for a crash or a
Yeah,
downturn
right.
or an upturn or whatever. Probably when you start to hear a lot of funeral homes on classic rock stations, you pretty much should sell your radio stock. That would probably be like the big warning. Time to go.
Anyway,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
active rock has been kind of going through a little bit of a change recently in that a lot of the music of the last maybe 20 years in this format has done pretty well. The artists have continued to tour. Foo Fighters have crossed into almost all of these formats in one way, shape, or form. They are the one band that's probably on every single station that we're talking about here, even
And
classic
on
rock.
Netflix with specials and stuff. So yeah,
Yeah.
they're in a class by themselves.
Right. And really, because of them, there's a lot of other bands that are maybe in their wake, but also bands that have established themselves also in different ways. And the other key is that most of these bands aren't played anywhere else.
Right.
CHR's not going to play them. Hot AC is not
No.
going to play them. Alternative stations are barely going to touch them. Adult alternative, probably not. Classic rock, they're too new. I mean, this is the only place to go. And some of these artists have built up a pretty good following. So active rock has been able to center itself a little bit more into the 2000 plus parts of its library, still maintaining a pretty strong 90s presence to most of the stations, but clearly, they are allowing more titles in and relying a little bit more on the stuff from this century and not the last century. And that's probably been the real big change. Alternative has really changed a lot. If you went back 15 years ago and looked at the average chart, you'd see active rock and alternative, and you'd go, maybe 60% of the hour, the songs could be on either station. But that's all changed. The last 5 or 6 years, alternative has really moved away from harder rock titles. It's gone into a lot more current driven and more recurrent driven. It's got more female and pop leaning songs. A rock artist might be Imagine Dragons, which hardly gets any airplay anywhere but alternative now outside of CHR. They've almost looking a lot more at the female side that could listen to a rock sound. And now that we've got this movement towards the pop world and a female world, you've tended to see the alternatives go down to one in a market.
I'm just looking at the time because we were talking about this, for those of you watching, we were talking about this, that Dave has so much history and stuff that maybe we might split this into two, because I got a ton of questions and things about the format and specifics. So if you're going to be programming a rock station of, when I say specifics of like, hey, the library should be roughly this size, and, and here's the percentages of this, that, and the other thing that, get you a pretty good starting point. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. We'll call this Rock Part A, and that's a sort of the history lesson to bring you up to today. Next up, we'll do Part B, and now we'll try to post both of these in this week, so you don't have to wait an entire week for it to come around. I'll see if I can do both of them. Boom, boom. Depending on how fast I can edit these things. Okay, so that's it for now, and we will come back with Part B.